Next.js has quickly become one of the most popular frameworks on the web, powering many of the sites that you visit daily. This guide is going to be a no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point introduction to Next.js. It is one of the easiest frameworks to get started with, but mastering it is a whole different story. First, let's take a step back. React was created by a team of developers at Facebook, and then another group of developers came along and added the essential features that React developers always seem to need. This combination gave birth to Next.js. Let's just start from scratch. You can just install Next.js by doing npm create next app at latest. Run the command and Next.js will be installed on your computer. At this point, you might see a lot of files and folders in your project. Don't worry about all of them for now. Focus on the src and the app folder. These are the core parts of your Next.js application. When you visit the root URL / it will be served from here. Next.js uses a specific routing pattern. If you create a folder inside the app directory, that folder becomes a root. For instance, if you have a folder named about inside the app, visiting the /about in your app will render the contents of that folder. You can nest the folders as deeply as you can. From this, you can say that Next.js uses a file-based router where folders are used to define the routes and files are used to create the UI for that route segment. Next.js also follows a specific file convention that's the key to its routing system. The layout.jsx file is shared among the multiple routes. For instance, if you have a folder structure like this, the layout defined in the folder will be applied to both /dashboard and the /dashboard/settings pages. Keep in mind that only the root layout can have the HTML and body text. Inner layouts should use elements like div or section. The page.jxs file, on the other hand, defines a unique UI for each route and makes those routes publicly accessible. Each time you visit a route, the corresponding page.jxs file is triggered to render the content. There are many other custom files in Next.js. For example, the loading.js file allows you to create meaningful loading UIs using the React suspense. Think of it as a skeleton screen that appears immediately when navigating, improving the user experience by clearly indicating that something is loading. The notfound.js file displays a custom for not for page when a route doesn't exist. Next.js automatically shows a default notfound page if you don't add one, but you can always create a new file called notfound.js and you can customize it to match your app's design. Another important file is the root.js file. This is where you handle the API requests for a route. If you need to fetch data from the back, you can define endpoints like get or post here. Just remember that you can't have page.js and the root.js file in the same folder. Instead, place the root.js file in an API folder. You might have noticed that the deeply nested routing such as app/account/dashboard/building/page.js can be quite messy. To keep things organized, you can use root groups. Root groups help streamline your URL structure. By placing folder names inside parentheses, you can omit those folders from the URL. This way, your URL remains clean and easy to manage. So using root groups, the structure app/account/dashboard/building/page.js will correspond to localhost 3000/billing. The parenthesis indicates that these folders are part of the root group and will be omitted from the URL, resulting in a more organized path. Just remember that only page.js and the root.js files are routable. All other files in the folder won't be accessible from the browser. You can also use dynamic routing by wrapping the folder's name in a square bracket. This is especially useful for scenarios like multiple products or blog pages where a single route can handle various parameters. And then there is parallel routing. What's that, you will ask? Parallel routing lets you conditionally render one or more pages within the same layout. For instance, you could have different dashboard pages for the admin and the user. Parallel routes in Next.js are defined using a feature called slots. You can define a slot using the @folder naming convention. Each slot is then passed as a prop to the corresponding layout.jsx file. This feature allows you to handle each route independently, giving each slot its own loading and error states. For example, if user analytics data takes a while to load, you can show a spinner specifically for that section while keeping other parts of the dashboard interactive. Another type of routing is intercepting routes. These routes lets you intercept or modify the default routing behavior to present an alternate view. For example, imagine having a navigation bar with a login link. Typically, the link will navigate you to a full login page, but with intercepting routes, you can display a login model which will keep the URL as /login. This approach can make the link shareable and ensures that the full login page is shown on page reloads or direct accesses. In Next.js, you have to use the dot convention to match the segments on the same level. To intercept the navigation from /folder to /folder1/folder2, create a .folder2 directory within the folder1 at the same level as the folder2. Define a new component in the page.txt for this setup. With this configuration, clicking on the link updates the URL to /folder1/folder2 but shows the intercepted root content. A page reload will, however, display the original folder2 content. In Next.js, the dot convention is used to match the root segments at the same level. A single dot matches the segments at the same level, two dots matches segments one level above, and a structure like this matches the segment 2 level above, and a structure with 3 dots matches a segment from the root app directory. Sometimes you need to run a piece of code before a request is completed. That's where middlewares comes in. Middlewares is perfect for tasks like authentication, authorizations, etc. It can check the user's identity and section cookies before actually granting access to specific pages or API routes. To set up middlewares in Next.js, create a middleware.ts file in the root of your project. For instance, if you want to protect your API routes, you can configure middleware just like this. Now that we have covered routing, let's dive directly into fetching data in Next.js. As a full-stack framework, Next.js is also good at handling data. You can fetch data in two main ways, from the server or from the client. Most of the time, you will use server components to fetch the data. This approach has its perk, like preventing sensitive information such as access tokens, API keys from being exposed to the client. However, don't rely solely on server components for security. You should set up an API route to protect your data. Keep in mind that server-side fetching will re-render the entire page. If you need more flexibility and don't want a full page reload, consider using a client-side fetching. In Next.js, you have mainly 4 options for data fetching. Fetch API. This is a built-in API which is made on top of the Fetch API. You can just use this method for making HTTP requests. You can also use any kind of database clients like ORMs like that. You can also use some client-side fetching libraries like the React query. You can also use the default route handlers, which is like you can create an API endpoint in the app itself. There is also a new feature in Next.js called the server actions. These are asynchronous functions executed directly on the server, designed to handle form submissions and data mutations. To use server actions, simply add the use server directive at the function or the module level within a server component. This marks the function as a server action. If you want to call a server action from the client component, create a new file, add the use server directive at the top of the file, and define your function there. These functions, acting as advanced API endpoints, can be called from the client or the server components. Note that server actions only support post method. By now, you might be wondering about server components and client components. So what's the difference? The code you wrote should be converted into user interface. In Next.js, you can choose where to render your components, on the client side or on the server side. Server components are designed to be rendered and optionally cached on the server. They generate the UI on the server side, meaning that they can handle data fetching and other server-side logic before sending the actual final HTML to the client. On the other hand, client components runs in the browser. They can use client-side features like the window object or the on-click events, which are not available on the server. This means the code for the server components and the client components isn't always interchangeable. When we talk about server-side rendering, we usually picture a process like this. A user visits a website, a Node.js server receives the request and immediately renders the React application generating the HTML. The freshly baked HTML is then sent to the client. This is a common approach to server-side rendering, but it is not the only way. Another method is to generate the HTML file during the build process, which is called static site generation. Typically, React applications need to be compiled, transforming JXs into JavaScript and bundling modules. What if during the build phase we pre-rendered all the HTML for our routes? This is exactly what static site generation does. The key difference is that server components never re-render. They always run once on the server to generate the HTML, which is then sent to the client and remains static. Since the rendering happens on the server, you cannot use the client-side hooks like useState or useEffect here. Another approach is dynamic rendering. With dynamic rendering, routes are rendered at the request time for each individual user. This method is particularly useful when a route needs to display data personalized for the user or when the information depends on factors that are only available at the request time, such as cookie or URL or search parameters. Next, let's talk about client components. Here's the thing. If you thought that adding the use client meant the content would be generated entirely on the client side, like a single page application, that's a common misconception. In Next.js, client components are still rendered on the server. By default, everything in Next.js is a server component. To turn something into a client component, you need to use the use client directive at the top of the file. If you need interactive features like on-click, hover effects, or any other user-driven events, you will need to use client components for that. When you load a page for the first time, here is what happens. On the server, React converts the server components into a specific format called the React Server Component Payload. This payload also includes references to the client component. Next.js uses the RSC payload along with the client components JavaScript to generate the HTML page on the server. On the client, the HTML is immediately used to display the basic version of the web page. The RSC payload is used to synchronize the client and server component structures, ensuring the page updates correctly. JavaScript is then activated and the client components now have the interactivity to the page. Now, when navigating back and forth in your application, remember that the client components are rendered entirely on the client without server rendered HTML. So the ideal way to use it is, if you need something that feels like it should be run on the server, it should be run on the server. For example, data fetching, keeping something safe, etc. When you feel like the user have to do something with it, keep the component as client. Easy, right? Next.js by default doesn't give you an error when you use something like this on the client. But since it have API keys, it doesn't work on the client. If you put next public in front of the API key, the client can also see the API key, which should not happen unless you are okay with huge credit card bills. For that, there are mainly two packages like the client only and the server only package. Use it so that when the next time when you mess up something, it will give you an error on the build time. These are the technical things that you need to know. When it comes to styling your Next.js app, Tailwind CSS is the clear winner. It is the most popular choice out there. Personally, I am all in on Tailwind and I wouldn't use anything else. Now let's talk about optimization. Next.js comes in with some built-in tools for your app to run smoothly. For instance, the image component in the Next.js is a game changer. It automatically optimizes the image for performance. If you're working with local images, you can just import them directly and use them without any problem. For external images, you must define a list of supported URL patterns in your next.config.js file to ensure that everything is handled effectively. Another cool feature is the ability to use the script tag from the next/script. This allows you to load third-party scripts across multiple routes. Just import the module and include the script directly in your layout. When it comes to deployment, the simplest way to get your app live is by using Vercel. Just head over to the site, connect your GitHub and you are all set. It's quick, easy and perfectly integrates with Next.js. But if you're looking to get a bit more fancy, you can deploy it on an AWS EC2 instance. Clone your repo out there, set up a reverse proxy and connect your domain. It's a bit more work, but it always gives you more control over the deployment environment. You now have everything that you need to dive in and start building. For anything beyond this, check out the official docs. Seriously, no one's going to spoon feed you all the details. That's what separates a 1x developer from a 100x developer. Subscribe so that I can bring more like this. Peace out.